Hello, pre-calculus folks. This is a review video for the second page of our review, and this is on solving trig equations. And you're going to have a variety of problems to solve tomorrow on the second page. And if you look at this first problem, it was a linear trig equation because it was only sine of x or sine of theta, not sine squared. And in this case, you solve for sine of theta, you find the ratio of sides, you use your reference triangle, and from the reference triangle, you find out what your reference angle is. It's because the ratio is negative, that tells us that the sine ratio is going to be, or the sine is only negative in quadrants 3 and 4. So when we look at that reference angle in those quadrants, that would be a 60-degree angle or a 60-degree angle there. So we're basically looking at, for the first answer, 240 degrees. And for the second answer, that would be 300 degrees because it's that reference angle in quadrant 4. Looking at number 2, it's again another linear trig ratio. Solve for secant of theta. You get negative 2 over root 2. But before you do anything, switch it to cosine. You get root 2 over 2. It's negative. That should tell you that you have a 45, 45, 90. And your reference angle is 45. Because the ratio is negative, using all students take calculus, we are not going to definitely be in, because cosine is negative, we're going to be in the second and the third quadrant. So when you draw a 45 in either one of those quadrants, you get your two angles. So the first angle is going to be 135 degrees. That's a quadrant 2 reference angle of 45. And the other one will be 225, simply by adding 180 degrees to that reference angle. In the next one, you see we have a quadratic trig equation. This requires solving, because we have a quadratic term and a constant term, we just solve for sine squared of theta. And then when we solve for sine of theta, we get two answers, plus or minus root 3 over 2. So we have two things to solve. We have sine of theta is equal to root 3 over 2, the plus part, and sine of theta is equal to negative root 3 over 2. Our reference angle is going to be 60 degrees in both cases. It's just which quadrant are we in? And because sine is positive for this solution, then theta 1 and theta 2 will be first quadrant, 60, and second quadrant, because sine is positive, second quadrant, that'll be 120. For this one over here, theta 1 will be equal 240 degrees, because that's quadrant 3, and the other angle will be 300 degrees, because you're in quadrant 4. So now we come along to another quadratic trig function. So you should just factor these out. So I'm just going to factor these out. So I have both terms set to 0. So in this one, I have the cosine of theta is equal to 1/2. That means my reference angle is 60 using that triangle. Because it's a positive ratio, I'm in quadrant 1 and quadrant 4 for cosine, and that'll mean that I have a 60-degree angle and a 300-degree angle. Over here, I have the cosine of theta is equal to 3, which has no solution. As we discussed, it's because that the range of cosine is only between 1 and negative 1. Last two problems. Here we do some simple factoring. We have cotangent of theta plus 1 times cotangent of theta plus 1 equals 0. These are identical terms, so I only have to solve one. Cotangent of theta equals negative 1. I set it to 0. Sorry, I'll do that first. I set it to 0. I solve for cotangent of theta. It's negative 1. I'll solve for tan of theta by doing the reciprocal. It's still negative 1. The reference angle for tangent to be 1 is 45, because the sides are equal. Opposite and adjacent, that is. And the tangent is the opposite over the adjacent, so our reference is 45. The first answer, because tangent is negative, is in quadrant 2, and the second is in quadrant 4. So 45 in quadrant 2 is 135 degrees. In quadrant 4 is 315 degrees. Last one, we have to do a trig substitution because the trig terms don't match. So I'm going to do 2 times 1 minus sine squared of theta plus sine of theta plus 1 equals 3. I distribute the 2 plus sine of theta plus 1 equals 3. Because it's nonlinear, everything gets moved over to one side. And now I cancel out the 2's because they add to subtract each other. So then I'm going to take out the sine, the greatest common factor, because there's only 2 terms left, this term and this term. So I'm going to take out sine of theta and I have negative 2 sine of theta plus 1. Everything equals 0. And then theta in this case will equal 0 and 180 from my chart. And from this one, sine of theta will equal positive 1/2. And we've solved this problem many times before. The reference angle is 30 degrees for a 30-degree reference angle. Sorry, is 30 degrees for the 1/2 ratio of sine. And the first solution to that is in quadrant 1 because sine is positive, and the second solution is in quadrant 2 where the angle is 150 degrees. Hopefully this video has helped you recollect some thoughts on how to solve trig equations and all the other aspects of what we're going to be studying on the test or taking on the test tomorrow. And I look forward to hearing your comments.